audience, welcome to the show POWERchat. In today's episode, we are planning to discuss about the situation of media ethics and the regulation across the world, in particularly linking the idea into the operation of community radio stations in the South Asia, including Nepal. Joining me today is Dr. Venkat Iyer, internationally known lawyer who has worked in different institutions as the media laws expert. Please allow me to welcome him. Welcome to the show, Dr. Iyer.
Thank you very much.
How have you been?
I'm very well, thank you, and I'm delighted to be here.
It is my pleasure to have you in my show. Let's begin with the situation of media regulation in the global context. Would you highlight on how media institutions in general and the community radio stations in particular operate in the global environment?
It is a very mixed picture. As you can imagine, the situation concerning regulation in the media varies not only from continent to continent, but also within countries. And in those circumstances, it's very difficult to imagine a particular model of regulation. You have at one extreme very tight regulation, which is usually through very strict laws. At the other end, you have countries where there is almost no regulation. It's a free for all. And I would say that most countries have something in between. Now, if you talk about regulation, it is actually quite a complex area, because you can either have statutory regulation, that is legal regulation using laws passed by parliament, or you can have self-regulation, which is often implemented by bodies like press councils or media councils. And you sometimes have what some people have referred to as hybrid regulations. That is to say, a combination of the two. And you would have, for example, a press council which has been set up by law passed by the national legislature, but which is given a degree of autonomy. So that is another form of regulation. But just in terms of the regulatory scene all over the world, as I said, there is a very wide variation in the scope of regulation, the severity of regulation, etc. If you look at the particular scenario in relation to community radio, quite frankly, community radio is...
Well, Dr. Iyer, I'll come back to you about community radio regulation. What do you mean by some countries or some societies not having regulations? Are you referring to the political system? Because of the political system, some countries have a very loose media regulations and some of them have tight one. Are you referring to the political system?
Not necessarily, because it is possible sometimes for a country not to have regulations, not because of politics, but because the country may lack legal infrastructure or may have just come out of war, in which case they have yet to get to grips with a regulatory framework. So that is the reason, or that is a context in which I was talking about there being no regulation. But it's also a reflection sometimes of the state of society, because in a given society there may be a demand for more regulation, and in a different society people may tend to be more skeptical about regulation.
So basically it is the societal need rather than the regulation from the governing sides.
Partly.
Do you mean that?
Partly. But also sometimes it may be inertia on the part of lawmakers. So in some countries it will be very difficult to pass laws. For example, if there is a coalition government and somebody proposes a legal measure, it is impossible to carry that measure through parliament because of lack of numbers. In other words, the arithmetic of parliament can also sometimes determine the state of regulation. And I'm talking now only about media regulation. I'm not talking about regulation in general, because you can have regulation in other areas, industrial regulation, etc.
Exactly.
But in media regulation, it is a function of all those factors. Sometimes it's also pressure from the media industry, because if the media industry is strong enough to resist regulation that is severe, then of course you would have weak regulation. Equally, if the media industry is not strong, then you can have an authoritarian government passing very strict regulatory measures.
What is the link in between the regulation and free expression? There are two sides in terms of consuming the content of media globally. One side is that the governing side, the governing bodies, the state agencies, they always try to regulate media some or other context. And the other side always demands with the free expression or more freedom in the dissemination of content. What is the linkage between freedom of expression or free expression and the regulation of media?
Yes, it's actually a very complex topic. I need to actually begin by telling you that in very broad terms, there are two types of regulation. One is business regulation, the other is content regulation. So it's perfectly possible in a given society that you will have a lot of regulations on the business side of media. For example, you would have regulation relating to monopolies, cross-media ownership, those sort of things. In other words, to ensure that there's a fair and even playing field for media businesses. But on the other side, you have content regulation, that is regulation about what is broadcast or what is said in the newspapers. Now, those are two different things. It is possible in a given country for there to be very strong business regulation and very weak content regulation, vice versa. But in most countries, I would say the level of regulation would be roughly of equal severity between business and media. But going back to your question of the connection with freedom of expression, obviously it's very important. But remember, sometimes a government can achieve its purposes without passing laws that look very severe. So you don't necessarily have to have a law that imposes censorship on the media for the media to be controlled. You can sometimes achieve the same objective by having very tough business laws which prevent the media from developing and from expressing itself very freely. To give you an example, some years ago, India had very strong laws on the business side. For example, a media company could not import equipment without paying very high customs duty. Now, that by itself can have a restrictive effect on freedom of expression, because if you're not allowed to have proper equipment, then, and you're a TV company, it's very difficult to be able to give free expression.
Is there a common ground that despite the differences in governing system across the world, can the media fraternity and the governments across come together to have a similar type of media regulation that is acceptable to the content receivers? Do you think so?
No, simply because the dynamics within societies are so different. And secondly, the political pressures are also very different between societies. And in those circumstances, it will be very difficult to think of a particular template for regulation. And remember as well that economics plays a very big role in all this. In other words, how developed is your country economically? If your country is very prosperous, then certain dynamics come into play. You then begin to think about avoidance of monopolies, anti-competitive practices, etc. But if you have a very small, undeveloped economy, then you have to think about other things. Now, to give you another example, in your region, Bhutan is a country which has...
in South Asia.
Yes, which has a very small population, which is also economically still developing. Now, there is no competition in the media in Bhutan, and also it's very difficult for example, for TV channels to get advertisements if the market is so small. So that's one of the big constraints.
Are you trying to tell that the political system matters, especially in the countries like Bhutan, where freedom of expression in some context is not comparatively allowed to practice? Do you mean?
No, I don't mean that. I mean actually that economics sometimes dictates, or market conditions sometimes dictate the state of regulation. So if you do not have a market that is large enough for competition to happen, then clearly the dynamics are different. So for example, in Bhutan there is only one broadcaster, and that is the Bhutan Broadcasting Service. Now that broadcaster will obviously have a monopoly, and in those circumstances the degree of freedom available to both the people who want to have their say and the people who want to receive broadcasts would be different from a society where there's a lot of competition. If you don't like one channel, go to another channel. That cannot happen in a country where there's only one channel.
Would you say about the media regulation and media ethics in the region you are working, especially in the UK? And also, would you shed light on the global indicators of media regulations that can be applied anywhere in the world despite the differences and diversity?
In terms of global indicators, the starting point is freedom of expression. So you would have, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which guarantees freedom of expression. You would have also instruments like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And then, of course, the famous Article 19, which is found in both those documents, which talk in general terms about everybody having the right to free speech. But the difficulty is that those laws are, first of all, very general, and secondly, they cannot be applied directly domestically. So they are just very broad principles. Ultimately, those laws also give a lot of freedom to national governments and national parliaments to pass laws which are broadly compatible with those principles, but which still allow for restrictions to be placed. So that is where the problem is. So if you have a country which has very strict laws, the government of that country can justify those laws sometimes by saying, look, the international instruments allow us to impose restrictions, and we are simply allowing restrictions because our society is not developed or has got problems. It is deeply divided. There is insurgency. There is a threat to national security. There are so many issues coming in. So there is no one size fits all template for media regulation around the world.
Dr. Iyer, you highlighted on the issue of national security. Everywhere there is the issue is highlighted by the state agencies, citing that their national security is in problem. So do you think that in the name of national security, freedom of expression can be limited?
Certainly.
Or there are some other issues that can limit the free speech?
There is definitely a case that can be made for restricting freedom of expression on grounds of national security. That cannot be denied, because ultimately the security of a country is important. But that ground for restriction is often abused by governments, because sometimes a government may say that national security requires us to impose very severe restrictions, when actually the situation on the ground may not require that degree of regulation. Now, what is the solution to that problem? The solution to that problem would be twofold. One is, of course, the vigilance of the people, because in a democracy it is possible to change governments. So if the people are unhappy with the way a government has imposed restrictions on the media on grounds of national security, they can change the government. That is if there's a democracy. If there's no real democracy, then that fails. But the second important safeguard in that respect, and to my mind it is the most important safeguard, is an independent and impartial judiciary. To my mind, that is extremely important. And it is important not just in relation to national security, it is important in relation to all aspects of freedom of expression.
Do you see the international community, the countries around the world, have such a judicial mechanism that addresses these issues?
Sadly not. In fact, that is one of the big deficiencies around the world. There are many countries where the judiciary is not either as strong or as independent or as impartial or as courageous as one would like. And in those circumstances, clearly there is a problem. But on the other hand, you have countries where the judiciaries have asserted themselves in the cause of free speech. But the judiciary also has to carry out a balancing exercise. In other words, they cannot simply accept the word of an NGO or an activist, just as they cannot simply accept the word of the government. So it's a very difficult area, but if you have a good judiciary, I think the prospects are better for freedom of expression.
Let's hope so. You are also working with the institutions related to community broadcasting, including that of the radio and television, and you have traveling around Southeast Asia, South Asia. You are currently here in a conference. How do you evaluate the regulatory mechanism of the community broadcasting system in the global South or the Southeast Asia?
As we heard at the conference yesterday from the Minister of Information from Bangladesh, the picture is a very mixed one. And quite frankly, the number of countries that have community radio stations in a sustained and organized way is quite small. If you look at the totality of the picture, then community radio is big only in a small number of countries. And in those countries as well, there is a variation in the regulatory mechanisms and regulatory frameworks. I would say that Nepal is a very good example of the vibrancy of community radio in a way that you do not find in many other countries, not just in the region, but also globally. But I was surprised to hear yesterday that there is very little regulation of community radio in Nepal. So that is an interesting fact which deserves to be kept in mind.
In fact, the radio stations here in Nepal are not categorized as community by the government. This is a claim, or this is a self-defined terminology by the community radio operators. So are there some examples of radio stations are separated or divided as named as the community radio?
Yes.
Is it necessary to have national laws that directly defines radio as community radio or some other sort of radio?
It is not strictly necessary, but it is helpful. For example, if you look at Australia, Australia has a very vibrant community radio world landscape. Now they do have laws which offer certain benefits to these community stations, also in terms of what the responsibilities of community radio should be. So it is helpful because there's also the possibility of community radio stations banding together and trying to make common cause. And for those reasons, if there was at least an acknowledgement of community radio as a distinct aspect of broadcasting, then clearly the community radio operators would be in a better position to at least make representations and also to fulfill their ambitions, their aspirations, etc.
What is the definition of community radio or broadcasting? How does the community radio differ from the other types of media, say private or public?
Yeah, what you might call mainstream broadcasting or mainstream radio.
Exactly.
There are a number of ways in which you can distinguish community radio from what, for want of a better term, you would call mainstream radio. First of all, community radio is generally seen as a non-profit enterprise. In other words, community radio stations are seen as not for profit. Secondly, you would have a defined target audience for community radio, which is usually a clearly identified community, not just broadcasting to the population at large. You would also notice that community radio involves a certain set of social objectives which need to be met, which are different from commercial broadcasting. And then you would have a situation where community radio would very strongly allow the community access to the system and also participation in the system. So these, I feel like, the broad defining characteristics of community radio. Plus, community radio is meant to be accountable to its target audience. So if you have these factors, you could possibly try to work out a definition for community radio.
Well, mostly the community radio content and community radio stations are here in Nepal, also in the South Asia, are criticized for not really being worked with the community people. And you said that one of the features of community radio is a non-profit business.
Yes.
It's in fact not a business. and non-profitability is there.
Yep.
What is your observation about the radio stations in the name of community operating around the world? Do you think that radios are really community based? They are not seeking profit, or there is something else in the name of community?
Again, the experience is very varied, and actually I was quite surprised to hear that the scenario in Nepal is not quite as clean cut as has been sometimes made out to be. But in general terms, the record of community radio stations around the world is a good one, because if you look at many countries, the stations, which are quite small, serve the community quite beneficially. In other words, there is a lot of cooperation between the target audience and the operator, which is important, because if you don't have that link, then the entire rationale for community radio would collapse. And therefore the involvement of the community is very important, and I would say that generally speaking there is a lot of involvement between audiences and the operators in many of the community radio stations around the world. Therefore, to that extent, you would have to focus on that aspect more than the profitability aspect. But simply because there is a perception that community radio should be not for profit does not mean that they cannot, for example, accept advertising. Because remember that community radio also has to survive commercially or financially, and for them to do that they will have to get money. Now subscriptions is not an option, because the communities that these radio stations serve may not be very rich, they may not be able to afford high subscriptions. So you may have to involve advertising or commercial sponsorship. Now the way to ensure that that is done properly is for the regulation to specify.
So you mean there is room for advertising in the community radio as well?
Undoubtedly.
What about the subsidies that most often community radio across this region seek from the government? Do you think that seeking subsidies from the government institutions most of the time, and at the same time can community radio be visible upon the wrongdoings of the state agencies? How do you analyze this?
There is a very serious risk of the independence of the community radio station being compromised through subsidies. There is no doubt about that. But on the other hand, given the state of economics in many of the countries in which community radio stations operate, it will be very difficult for them to avoid any state help. I'm not saying therefore that that should become the norm. Actually, I personally would prefer a situation where any broadcaster does not accept subsidies from the government, because at the end of the day you are tying your hands to some extent. But as I said, if you have a good mix of revenue source, a little from commercial advertising, a little from sponsorship, a little maybe from subsidies, then maybe that might work. But reliance on one particular source is very dangerous. So if a community radio station was operating solely on the basis of subsidies received from the government, then clearly there's going to be a problem of independence.
Well, Dr. Iyer, there are so many issues to discuss, but we are coming to the end of the show. Anything that you wish to share to our audience, especially in the context of Nepal? You are here to attend the conference, and you discussed with so many issues of community radio here in Nepal.
Well,
anything quickly.
The first thing I would say is that I wish the community here, which relies on broadcasting, the very best of luck. Secondly, I would say that if the community radio broadcasters are thinking about bringing in regulation, they should think very carefully. That simply because there is no system of regulation at the moment does not mean you should rush into regulation that will be faulty. So give it careful thought and make sure that you balance all the competing interests very carefully. As somebody said, sometimes it's not a bad idea to have no regulation, because no regulation is sometimes better than bad regulation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking to you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Dear audience, time now to wrap up the show. Keep watching us. See you next week. Namaste.